Hello, this is History 321, and I am Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is video lecture number 12. All right, we're going to start talking about the Civil War in Louisiana today. Now, uh, by the time that Louisiana leaves the Union in January of 1861, five other southern states had already seceded. Um, a special session of the Louisiana State Legislature was called on in January. By that time, the governor of Louisiana, his name was Moore, Moore, had already started to seize federal property in Baton Rouge and in New Orleans. Um, the legislature voted to secede, and most of the citizens of Louisiana were happy with the decision, although there were some who were saddened by the turn of events. So let's take the Civil War year by year in Louisiana. That might be the way to do it, just on a year-to-year basis. All right, now Louisiana secedes from the Union in January of 1861. But that doesn't mean that Louisiana immediately joins the Confederacy. Oh, that's a little better. No, what happens is that the state flag flies over the capital first for almost 2 months. Um, then it was replaced. It was replaced by uh, a flag called the flag of the Republic of Louisiana. It was really, really ugly. 13 stripes, 6 white, 4 blue, 3 red. It represented the 13 original states of the original United States and the tricolor of France. The French flag was red, white, and blue. Now, in the upper left-hand corner of that flag was a 5-pointed yellow star, um, which represented the red and yellow colors of Spain. So it was trying to sort of bring France and Spain and the United States into the flag. And the result was a historically significant flag, but a really ugly flag. In 1861, all of the remaining federal property in the state of Louisiana was taken over by the state, and that included military installations, uh, the U.S. Mint, along with about $600,000 of United States currency and coin, the U.S. Custom House in New Orleans. All of this was taken over by the state of Louisiana in the year 1861. And in March of 1861, Louisiana officially joins the Confederate States of America. Now, once Louisiana was officially a part of the Confederacy, the remainder of the year was spent in preparation. Military supplies were assembled. Industrial plants were created to make goods locally, to make goods within the state of Louisiana that were normally bought from northern states. Scrap iron, for example, was collected statewide. The purpose, of course, would be to be remelted and repurposed, recycled. So recycle is not something that is exclusively a 20th or a 21st century event. Uniforms, shoes, tents were produced. Uh, from what I could gather, there was a big shoe factory that existed in the present day town of Ponchatoula. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. The government, the Confederate government, and the Louisiana government encouraged people to plant larger food crops, not only to feed themselves, but to feed the soldiers as well. Governor Thomas Moore, I don't think I gave you his first name earlier, Governor Thomas Moore, called for volunteers to fight the federal forces. Now, during the war, 60,000 Louisianians volunteered for military service. 1/3 of those volunteered in the latter part of the year 1861. Many of the volunteers went to war without proper training, equipment, or supplies. Here in Tangipahoa Parish, up near the village of Tangipahoa, is Camp Moore, named after this governor. Camp Moore was a training facility, basically, fundamentally a basic training facility for many of the soldiers from Louisiana before they went off to war. The state of Louisiana built gunboats to guard the Mississippi River against being invaded on the river by United States Navy forces. And they strengthened the defenses of both Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, which had been built in a previous time. All right, 1862. The defenses at New Orleans were further strengthened. Trenches were dug. Artillery was emplaced at strategic points. Nearby bayous that could be used to sneak up behind New Orleans without coming straight up the Mississippi River. Many of those bayous were obstructed. Trees were cut down. That was especially true of Bayou Manchac. Now, we've talked about Bayou Manchac. We've not mentioned Bayou Manchac in a while. Bayou Manchac was one of those backdoor routes into New Orleans. Bayou Manchac left the Mississippi River south of Baton Rouge, went and connected to the Amite River. The Amite River, of course, flows into Lake Maurepas. Lake Maurepas is connected to Lake Pontchartrain. Lake Pontchartrain is connected to Lake Borgne. Lake Borgne is connected to the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, you can access the city of New Orleans from Lake Pontchartrain. So, to avoid the possibility of that happening, Bayou Manchac was further obstructed. And it remains obstructed today. Jackson had done it first to prevent the British from coming through the back door to New Orleans, and now the Confederates finish the job. Even to this day, it was obstructed so completely that it really is not navigable. It would take a huge expenditure of time and money to open up Bayou Manchac today to make it navigable again. Gigantic chains were stretched across the Mississippi River between Forts Jackson and St. Philip. And of course, the idea was that a sailing vessel that was unaware that the chains were there would be sailing up the Mississippi River, would strike the chains that were underwater, could not be seen, but were there, and would damage the rudder and the keel of the ongoing vessel. Now, how did all that work? Was it successful? Did it do its job? And the answer in a single word is no. And the phrase is no, not just no, but heck no, right? Because in April of 1862, a fleet commanded by Admiral David Farragut, it's Farragut, Admiral David Farragut, and carrying an army commanded by General Benjamin Butler, appeared off the mouth of the river, and that fleet began to sail upriver. They attacked Forts Jackson and St. Philip. They broke the chain, and they continued up the Mississippi River toward New Orleans. And so they that fleet fundamentally, but the defenses of the chain and Forts Jackson and St. Philip were insignificant. On April the 25th, the Confederate garrison at New Orleans, which was about 3,000 Confederate soldiers, they abandoned the city without firing a shot, and they retreated to Camp Moore here in Tajbaho Parish. And New Orleans was now in the hands of the Union, and it would remain in the hands of the Union uh, for the remainder of the war. That same Union fleet that had captured New Orleans continued to sail up the river and took Baton Rouge. Now, when the federal fleet approached Baton Rouge, the capital of Louisiana at that time was Baton Rouge, and so the capital was moved over to Opelousas. Now, during the Civil War, the capital of Louisiana was moved several times, always, though, for the same reason, to keep it out of the hands of the United States forces. Okay, so the first move is from Baton Rouge to Opelousas. Now, the Confederates in August of 1862 tried to take um, Baton Rouge back from the Federals, but they failed. It was a stiff fight, um, but they failed to accomplish their task. And as a result of that battle, the state capitol, the old state capitol, was burned, along with priceless records. And after the failed attempt by the Confederates to retake Baton Rouge, like New Orleans, then remained in Union hands for the remainder of the war. Now, in October of 1862, the Union Army invaded the Bayou Lafourche country. They occupied the towns of Thibodaux, Houma, and Morgan City, which we know was not called Morgan City then. It was called Brashear City. And then Butler was replaced as the commander of troops of the federal troops in Louisiana by General Nathaniel Banks. So, 1862 is not a good year for the Confederates in the state of Louisiana. 1863. All right, let's talk about 1863. In 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant, took command of the federal forces at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now, Vicksburg is right across the Mississippi River from the Louisiana town of Tallulah. Vicksburg was one of the strongest fortifications possessed by the Confederates on the entire Mississippi River. And Grant was convinced that whoever controlled Vicksburg would go a long way to controlling the entire Mississippi River. Now, in March of 1863, a Union detachment from a Union detachment invaded the Florida parishes. They came up from New Orleans. They came through the present-day village of Manchac. They pretty much followed the route of the railroad tracks, and they attacked Ponchatoula. They were repelled by Confederate soldiers. It wasn't really you couldn't call it a battle, but you could certainly call it a sharp skirmish between the Union forces, small Union force, small Confederate force. And those Union soldiers were then forced to return to New Orleans. Now, General Banks is now in command of all federal forces in Louisiana, and he invades. Now, remember, while it was commanded by Butler, the Union Army had invaded into the Bayou Lafourche country. Now, General Banks is in command, and he invades the Bayou Teche country. He took Opelousas. He continued on. He took the town of Alexandria. He did a lot of damage to the countryside. And once again, in order to prevent the Confederate capital of Louisiana from falling into federal hands, the capital was then moved to Shreveport. Now, Banks crosses the Mississippi River near St. Francisville up in the Felicianas, right? Right on the east bank of the Mississippi River, and laid siege to another strong fortress on the Mississippi River at Port Hudson. Now, in order to lay siege to Port Hudson required that Banks pull some of his soldiers out of Alexandria and Opelousas. And when the Federals did that, the Confederates moved back into Alexandria and Opelousas. But the Federals continued to concentrate on Port Hudson. There were 7,000 Confederate soldiers there. They had dug extraordinarily strong earth fortifications. There were 20,000 Federals who were now attacking Port Hudson, including black Federal troops who were from Louisiana, which is an interesting story in itself. When the Federal troops entered Louisiana, they fundamentally freed slaves wherever they went. This didn't take the Emancipation Proclamation. This didn't take the 13th Amendment. It was just a common sense idea that wherever the Federal Army went, they freed the slaves. And many of those slaves joined the United States Army. And they fight as black units under white officers. Pardon me. I'm so sorry for all the nose blowing and the coughing. Something is in the air that I'm deadly allergic to, I fear. The siege, the Federals finally realized that they were not going to be able to take Port Hudson by assaulting it, by attacking it. And so it settles into a siege. And we've talked about sieges before. In a siege, nothing goes in, nothing comes out. And no matter how well armed the defenders are, after you eat all the food and after you drink all the water, you are forced to surrender. That's what the goal of the Federals was, to force Port Hudson to surrender. That siege lasts more than 7 weeks. The Confederates fought on. Now, while the siege of Port Hudson is going on, remember Grant is doing the same thing up at Vicksburg. Grant had tried to attack Vicksburg in the normal way, and he had been repulsed also. And so now Vicksburg was undergoing and experiencing a siege itself. On July the 4th, 1863, word is received in Port Hudson that Vicksburg has surrendered to Grant. Port Hudson, the men at Port Hudson continue to fight on, but not for long. Remember that Vicksburg surrenders on the 4th of July. Port Hudson surrenders 5 days later on July the 9th. And with the fall of first Vicksburg and then Port Hudson, the Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River from way up north, where it comes out of that little lake, Lake Itasca, I think it is, in Minnesota, all the way to the mouth of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy was fundamentally cut in two. Those states that were east of it, and then there were states that were west of the Mississippi River, including the ones that were west were included Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas. Now, 1864 comes around. The Union had plans to completely occupy the state of Louisiana. Um, in January of 1864, Louisianians elect a new governor. His name is Henry Allen. In March of 1864, another federal fleet, another Union fleet, this one commanded by Admiral David Porter, with an army commanded by General Banks, went up the Red River with the purpose of capturing the state capital, which was now at Shreveport. Now, Shreveport was important to the Federals because, well, first of all, it was the Confederate capital of Louisiana, but it was more probably important to them because if the Federals could capture Shreveport, then they could use the city of Shreveport, there on the Red River, as a jumping off point to conduct an invasion of the Confederate state of Texas. The Federals took Alexandria again. The Confederates who had retaken Alexandria once. I'm sorry. The Confederates who had retaken Alexandria from the Federals now retreated back, heading back towards Shreveport. The Federals followed them. The Federals took the town of Natchitoches. And on April the 8th, there was a battle between the Federals and the Confederates at the present day, or near the present day town of Mansfield, Louisiana. It was a Confederate victory, but so many Confederates were killed in the Confederate victory. There were so many Confederates lost that the Confederacy could ill afford to lose. So yes, on paper it was a victory, but no, it didn't do anything to kick the Federals out of the state of Louisiana. The Federals, after the Battle of Mansfield, retreat to the town of Pleasant Hill. And there, the Confederates and the Federals fought another sharp skirmish. This time it was a Union victory. But Banks realized at this point that the campaign to take Shreveport and then continue on to the invasion of Texas, it was a disaster and it was not going to work. And so Banks and the Federals retreat first to Natchitoches, then to Alexandria. That 1864 campaign that really didn't settle anything was a disaster for the state of Louisiana, because with federal armies and Confederate armies all over western Louisiana, it meant that houses and cotton gins and mills and barns and fences, they were all destroyed. Horses and cattle, hogs were either taken as food or simply were killed and left to rot to deprive the Confederacy of them. Wherever the Union Army went, they, of course, freed the slaves. And those freed slaves followed the Union Army by the thousands. And it really became difficult for the Union Army. The Union Army felt an obligation to these freed slaves, but there was no way in the world that they could take care of them properly, feed them and clothe them and protect them properly. Now, as the Federals retreated from Pleasant Hill, about as far north as the invasion got, uh, the Confederates were chasing them, and they caught up with them a little bit below Alexandria. They were not strong enough to keep Banks from crossing the Atchafalaya and then the Mississippi River. Now, we know that the Civil War ends in 1865. What you might not know is that no further battles were fought in Louisiana in 1865. Because by this time, the South and Louisiana was exhausted. The citizens, even uh, the biggest supporter of secession and the Confederacy, the citizens knew that the war was lost. It was just a matter of time. The only question was, when is this going to end? As a matter of fact, soldiers, Confederate soldiers, began to desert and go home. Governor Moore encouraged the war effort, but it was too late. In April of 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to U.S. Grant at a little place in Virginia called Appomattox Court. That happens in April. Now, that doesn't mean the war is over. It simply means that Lee and his army are out of the fight. The war continues in other places. For example, in the areas that are west of the Mississippi River, there's still fighting going on. But that army, which was called the Army of the Trans-Mississippi, right? The army of the over on the other side of the Mississippi, surrendered in May 26th of 1865. And Governor Allen, the Confederate governor, ran away. He left the state and went to Mexico, and from all accounts took a large part of the treasury with him so he could live in wealth for the rest of his life. And so, by the spring of 1865, the Civil War was over. Now, if you were expecting me to give you a blow by blow, a day by day, a minute by minute explanation of each of these little battles and skirmishes that take place in Louisiana, I'm sorry to have disappointed you. The reality is that what happens in Louisiana is not that important in the large scheme of things. What is important happens on the edges of Louisiana, at New Orleans, at Port Hudson, which is in Louisiana, at Vicksburg, which is right across the river from Louisiana, and at Shreveport, which is in the northwest edge. Now, what happens next in the state of Louisiana is referred to as Reconstruction. Now, much of the state was ravaged by war. You don't have to have major battles fought on your soil for your state to be ravaged by war. That's what had happened. The Florida parishes were on their knees economically. Southwest Louisiana, northwest Louisiana, the areas around Vicksburg, Tallulah, over in east central Louisiana, were all ravaged, absolutely destroyed by the war itself. And Louisiana woke up one morning and realized that there were four problems that they had to solve in order to get back on their feet. First of all, the state and local governments had to be restored. Agriculture had to be restored. Industry had to be restored, and transportation had to be fixed. Uh, Louisiana had very little infrastructure before the Civil War, and much of it had been destroyed by the war. What few bridges there were in the state had been burned, had been destroyed. The railroads had been literally taken apart. It was not it was common for federal troops to come into an area and they would literally remove the rails from the cross ties. Then they would use the cross ties to build a fire. And then once the fire was red hot, they would put the rails on top of the fire until the iron got so hot that it became pliable. And they would then take those rails and wrap them around a tree. And of course, when the rail cooled, the rail was no longer ever capable of being used again because it was in the shape of a corkscrew. Just one example of the devastation, the destruction that took place to the infrastructure of the state of Louisiana. And number four, what was Louisiana going to do with the freedmen? What was Louisiana going to do with the former slaves who were now free? Now, many Northerners wanted revenge for the deaths and the injuries of hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers. Um, Many Northerners also wanted to be sure that the freedmen were well treated because they weren't going anywhere. They couldn't leave. Uh, they were uh, they were going to stay in the South, and the question becomes then: will the freedmen be well treated, or will they be abused? And of course, everybody wanted to make sure that another civil war never happens again. Now, President Lincoln was still alive. Of course, we know the sad story there. He would be assassinated. But at the end of the war, April of 1865, Lincoln was still alive. And what Lincoln preferred was that the Union be restored as quickly as possible. And so he created a plan that would permit that to happen. That would permit the Confederate States who had been in rebellion against the United States to return to the Union. And here are the rules. When 10% of voters who had voted in 1860 took an oath of allegiance to the United States and to the Constitution, they would receive a presidential pardon. And if they swore support for the emancipation laws, then that state could re-enter the Union. So it was sort of a two-part deal. One was things that individuals could do, and the other was things states could do. Okay, what could individuals do in order to uh, restore their rights of citizenship? When 10% of voters who had voted in 1860 took an oath of allegiance to the United States and to the Constitution, they would receive a presidential pardon. And along with that pardon, the assumption was that they would have all of their civil rights restored. Now, That was rather magnanimous of Lincoln. 10%. He didn't demand 50% or 60%. 10% was all. So he is bending over backwards to try to restore the Union. Now, when states then swore support for the emancipation laws, then the state could re-enter the Union officially. Now, these rules did not apply to all Southerners. Excluded were people who had been high officials of the Confederate government and high officers in the Confederate military. This didn't apply to them. Um, Men who had left the service, men who were serving the United States, men who were things like judges and congressmen and military officers in the United States service, who had left the service of the United States to serve the Confederacies, these rules didn't apply to them either. And another group did not have all of their rights restored, and that included those who were accused of failure to treat captured black soldiers and their officers as prisoners of war. Uh, More than one story is told about black soldiers who had surrendered or who were captured, still being shot down like dogs simply because they were black. If you were a Confederate soldier who had committed that crime, then the rules of regaining your citizenship didn't apply to you either. Now, unfortunately, we know Lincoln was assassinated shortly after the war ends. And his vice president, a man by the name of Andrew Johnson, who, by the way, was from Tennessee. Johnson was one of the few Southern members of the Congress who did not go home and take positions in the Confederate government. Andrew Johnson stayed in the Congress. He never resigned. He became Lincoln's running mate in the 1864 election. And when Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson becomes president of the United States. Now, let's don't brag on. Now, we need to brag on Andrew Johnson. That's true, because those things that I just mentioned, those are true things. But it's also true that Johnson was a racist, right? And he was certainly no friend of the freedmen. Now, what Johnson wanted to do fundamentally was to continue the policies of his old boss, Lincoln. But remember, I said that many in the North wanted revenge for the deaths and injuries of hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers? Well, the call for revenge, especially, let's play what if history for just a minute. It's always fun. It never settles a thing, does it? Had Lincoln not been assassinated, we think that because of the respect that Lincoln received from people, that he would have been successful in implementing his plan. But Lincoln is dead now. And Andrew Johnson does not have the strength of character and the strength of will that a Lincoln had. So the so-called radicals in the Congress, those who really wanted to punish the South, they didn't want to accept the South with open arms and let them re-enter the Union with very little punishment. They wanted to big time punish the South. So Lincoln's brand of Reconstruction we call presidential Reconstruction, right? But he's gone. So presidential Reconstruction is out the window, and the radicals are now in charge. Even though Johnson is the president, the radicals in the Congress are accumulating a lot of power and a lot of influence. And as a result, a second type of Reconstruction appears, and we refer to that as Congressional Reconstruction. And about as often as we hear it called Congressional Reconstruction, we also hear it called Radical Reconstruction. Now, some of the southern states attempted to re-enter the Union by using the formula that had been created by Lincoln that we talked about just a few moments ago. They elected people to the United States Senate, and they elected people to the United States House of Representatives. The problem was, or one of the major problems, was that many of the men that were elected from these states that are trying to re-enter the Union using presidential reconstruction are men who had served in key offices in the Confederacy. People who had been generals and colonels in the Confederate Army, admirals in the Confederate Navy, people who had worked, who had served in the Congress of the Confederacy, people who had served as officials under the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Many of these people were elected and sent back to the United States Congress. Now, the Constitution, as written in 1787, very clearly says that each house, each chamber of the Congress has the right to consider the qualifications of their own members. And which means that they have the right to say, yeah, you can become a member, or they can say, no, we don't want you. And many of the people who were elected, who had served in some capacity in the Confederacy, were refused a seat in the United States Congress. Now, something else is going on here. Many of the southern states, uh, the slaves are free. Slavery no longer exists. But does that mean that Southerners who just a short time ago were slave owners, does that mean that those Southerners are now willing to have a group hug with their former slaves? Of course not. They resent the fact that much of their capital has disappeared. They had invested, well, a bunch in human flesh to provide labor in their fields, and that is gone. What many people in the South, the former slave owners, what many of them now face is ruin, financial ruin. They still have the land that they owned previously, but they have no one to work it. So, even though the former slaves are now freed, they still live in the South, don't they? And so, all across the South, state legislatures begin to pass laws whose purpose it is to force the former slaves back into the fields, even though they are free. They're free. And many of these new laws are very similar to the old laws that existed during slavery. These new laws really attempted to control the day-to-day lives of the former slaves. It wasn't slavery, but it was a first cousin to slavery. It was closely related to slavery. Now, faced with the insistence of the South that they'd be permitted to send to the Congress all of these Confederates who just recently had fought against the United States. And given the fact that many of the states were passing these laws whose purpose it was to really restrict the lives of the former slaves, faced with those types of attitudes from an unrepentant South, right? South, they're not saying, oh, we're so sorry, we made a terrible mistake. No, they're trying to get back to business as usual. Congress decided to reconstruct the South. Now, let's use some little different words here. We've talked about presidential reconstruction, radical reconstruction. Can I change a word in there? Let's don't refer to presidential reconstruction. Let's call it presidential restoration. Because that's really what Lincoln wanted. He wanted the South restored to the Union. So let's use that term in the future. When we talk about the easy way to get back into the Union, let's refer to that as presidential restoration. And when we want to talk about the punishment of the South, let's talk about radical or congressional reconstruction. And as the result of the unwillingness of the Southerners to send, well, Southerners continued to try to send old Confederates to the Congress, and they continued to try to pass laws that would restrict the lives of the former slaves. And because of that, uh, Congress decided to reconstruct the South rather than restore the South. Now, a number of three uh, amendments were created in the 1860s after the Civil War was over. Um, uh, and all three dealt in some way with the former slaves. And collectively, those three amendments are called the Reconstruction Amendments. The first was the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment officially freed the slaves. It didn't just free them, it outlawed slavery. No longer could slavery exist in any state of the Union or any territory that was owned by the United States. That's what the 13th Amendment did. Now, the 14th Amendment was designed to give citizenship to the former slaves. Now, all the 13th Amendment did was outlaw slavery. It did not make citizens of the former slaves. It's the 14th Amendment that gives citizenship to the former slaves. Now, that's not the only thing the 14th Amendment does. It gives the 14th Amendment gives the rights of citizenship, and it's very specific. It gives all of the rights of citizenship to the former slaves, to the freedmen. It doesn't give them some of them. It doesn't give them most of them. It gives them all of the rights of an American citizen. In addition, the 14th Amendment punishes. Remember, many people in the North, especially the radical Reconstruction people, wanted to punish the South. Well, the 14th Amendment goes a long way to doing that. It takes citizenship away from anybody who supported the Confederacy. Fundamentally, that's what it does. And now, what it says is that uh, it can take the rights of citizenship away, and it can also give them back. And as it turns out, uh, all of the people who supported the Confederacy eventually got their civil rights back. There were just a few exceptions. Jefferson Davis, who was the only president that the Confederacy ever had, never received his citizenship back. He died as a man without a country. Only after his death were his rights of citizenship restored. And the other man was Robert E. Lee. Same deal. His citizenship was revoked, and for the rest of his life, he was a man without a country, and his citizenship was given back only after he was dead. So the 14th Amendment does a couple of things. It gives the right of all. It's not enough for us to say the right of citizenship. It's more important that we say gives all the rights of citizenship to the freedmen, and it punishes, which should not surprise us because we know that that's what the radicals wanted to do. It punishes those people who had supported the Confederacy. And the 15th Amendment, the last of the three Reconstruction Amendments, the 15th Amendment specifically gave the freedmen, the former slaves, the right to vote. Now, I tell my students, whenever the Constitution wants to make the point that something is really important, it'll say it twice. And that's the case here. Think about what I said about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment gave all the rights of citizenship to the former slaves. What is one of the rights of citizenship? It's the right to vote. So, the 14th Amendment actually gave the right to vote, along with all the other rights of citizenship. But the 15th Amendment, fundamentally, it doesn't say it like this, but the intent is, if you didn't catch the 14th Amendment, let me say it again. The former slaves now have the right to vote. Of course, now all former slaves didn't get the right to vote, did they? It was only adult males. Uh, Female former slaves, of course, didn't get the right to vote. But it was a huge step in the right direction. Okay, so many of white adult males in the South had supported the Confederacy by either serving in the Army or serving in the Navy or serving as a politician or serving as a judge. Or many of the white adult males, and because they had done that, they lose their citizenship. So, as the Southern states are readmitted to the Union, fundamentally, who can vote? Who can vote in Louisiana? Well, there were some Louisianians who had never supported the Confederacy. Now, it was not popular during the war, and so generally they would lay low and keep their mouths shut. But they didn't join the Confederate Army. They didn't serve the Confederacy in any way. And because they didn't do any of those things, when the war was over, they didn't lose their citizenship. And they didn't lose the right to vote. And they didn't lose the right to hold public office. Now, there was a negative sounding name that was given to these people by their fellow Louisianians, and not just Louisiana, across the South. They were called Scalawags, which is a negative sounding word. Scalawags, right? Many white adult Southerners considered the Scalawags were traitors. But in reality, it was the people who supported the Confederacy who were the traitors, and it was the Scalawags who were the loyalists. Okay, so the Scalawags can still vote. There's another group who can vote. After the war is over, remember I said that South and Louisiana was just absolutely devastated economically by the war. What hadn't been burned was trampled. There were people in the North who had money that they were willing to risk by investing in the South. And so a lot of these people got on a train, left New York City, left Boston, left Philadelphia, and they came to the South with money in their hands, that they were willing to invest, hoping that their investment then would really make them rich at some point in the future. All right? And these people were called carpetbaggers. Now, we've all heard of carpetbaggers. And if you are a white Louisianian today, you have been taught probably all of your life that a carpetbagger was a terrible person because you got most of your history from watching Gone with the Wind. And I've warned you about that. The reality is that there were some crooked carpetbaggers. There were some who were thieves. There were some who took advantage of a bad situation. But the reality is that most of these carpetbaggers were here risking their own money, hoping for a nice return on their cash. So the carpetbaggers had, of course, they were from the North. They had never supported the South. So who do we have so far who have the rights of citizenship in Louisiana? We've got the Scalawags, who never ever supported the Confederacy, although they were from the South. And we've got the carpetbaggers who also never supported the Confederacy because they were from the North. And what's the third group? And those two groups can vote. What's the third group? Well, it's the freed people. It's the former slaves. They now they now have the full rights of citizenship, including the right to vote. And so those three groups together, the so-called Scalawags, the so-called carpetbaggers, and the freed blacks that we are now referring to as freedmen, all of them have the full rights of citizenship. Members of those three groups, now, this is not always the case, but it is an accurate statement to say that generally all three of those groups, Scalawags, the carpetbaggers, and the freedmen, all were members of the Republican Party. And so the Republican Party emerges, the Republican power emerges in the South where it had never really existed before. Now, under radical Reconstruction, under Congressional Reconstruction, what did it take now to re-enter the Union? Well, new state constitutions each state had to rewrite its constitution, and the content of those new constitutions had to agree with the content of the United States Constitution, which meant that they had to write in the wording would vary from state to state, I'm sure, but they had to write into their constitutions that black citizens were now had the full rights of citizenship, and that slavery was dead. Uh, they also had to write into their state constitutions the idea that uh, all qualified males, and of course qualifying generally was uh, age, but all adult males could vote. And by doing that, what does that really do? It gives whites and blacks, adult males, the right. And specifically, state legislatures had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Now, remember what the 14th Amendment was? It was the amendment that gave full and total citizenship to blacks. Why didn't they demand that the 13th Amendment, which killed slavery, why didn't they demand that that be ratified? Or the 15th Amendment? Well, the 14th Amendment uh, was the one that gave the citizenship. And that is the one that was required to be ratified. You ratified the 14th Amendment, You satisfy the other things. You write the proper constitution. You create universal adult male suffrage, and then, and only then, can you re-enter the Union. Okay, that's a good place to stop. We'll pick up this thought in the next lecture. But until then, I'll see you soon.